So we are moving into our first panel today on open banking and open identity. I'd also like to welcome to the stage in seconds the Right Honourable Lord Maude of Horsham. As you are well aware, I'm sure, Lord Maude served in David Cameron's cabinet from 2010 to 2015, and under his leadership, the UK became world leader for digital government, creating the Government Digital Service, now replicated worldwide, and led the UK's programme on open data and transparency, guiding Britain to be the top-ranked country for open government. Thank you very much.
So what have you been up to?
Well, generally, or this morning?
Well, I'm seeing your tracks around the globe as you are talking to various governments and organizations about identity.
And among other things. I mean, I left government. I described myself as a refugee from government. Finally extricated myself March of last year. After having been a minister first with Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s and had a checkered career since then. So I've discovered my inner entrepreneur, having led the programme in the UK government on efficiency, public sector reform, cost cutting, as well as digital and open data. And as I was travelling around as a minister, so many governments where we were talking about what we were doing, so many of them said, "Oh my God, you've done that. Will you come and help us?" So the answer is, now I've left government, yes. And so we're working in various parts of the globe, and lots of enthusiasm for change. I mean, we were very lucky in the UK government. We hit a great moment. We had the advantage of a real crisis. We had the worst government IT programs in the world, and the most expensive. I don't want to boast, but and we had a budget deficit of 11% of GDP. So we had to, never let a good crisis go to waste. And so we had the real opportunity to make some serious change happen.
And you always saw the Verify program not as an identity thing unto itself, but as something that would be an economic driver.
Yeah. Well, a lot of what we did, not just on identity, but more widely with digital, we saw it absolutely as something which the government needed to make services better for the public and improve convenience for the public in the way they interacted with the government. And at a time when people were getting accustomed to doing conducting so much of their life through smartphones and the web generally, they found it incredibly difficult to interact with the government. The government has governments everywhere, and actually it's typical of a lot of slow-moving big organizations. They tend to expect their users to adapt themselves to the way the government happens to be configured, and actually citizens don't give a monkey's, which ministry they're dealing with. It's just the government. We discovered, for example, that there were something like 1,500 different government websites, all on different architectures, all about the government, that bit of government, none of it actually configured around the user. So we created a single web domain, gov.uk, open source code, now used by a number of other governments and constantly being iterated and adapted and improved. And so we delivered within 12 months of embarking on this project, a single web domain for the whole of the UK government at a fraction of the cost of how it was being done before. And so we opened up and we discovered that procurement was being done in a way that almost deliberately seemed to be freezing out the newer and the smaller ventures, which in the world of tech and digital is crazy, because that's where a lot of the innovation's coming from. You've got to show 3 years audited accounts, you've got to show a turnover threshold, you've got to put up a performance bond, you've got to show you've got insurance in place to cover the total of the bid before you're even allowed to bid. I mean, it was insane. So we opened all of that up. And of course, what that did was unleash a torrent of innovation and massively improve the kind of competitive tension to the benefit of the taxpayer and the innovation for the user. But also really sponsored and supported the UK-based tech startup sector. And so when you talk about identity, this was something which the government needed. We needed, our old identity system was not good, is the best way of, politest way of describing it. And we needed a new one. The government decided to abort the national identity card program. But we needed an identity assurance program, and so what was beginning to be developed was the origins of gov.uk Verify. And we, from the start, we saw this as something which, yes, the government needed and needed to invest in to create a system that would work for the public sector in its relationship with the users, with the citizens. But if we made a success of it, it could be the basis of opening up or allowing the accelerated development of the digital economy much more widely. And you know, particularly we saw early on that this could have huge use in the banking sector. And I just hope that the momentum behind that doesn't get lost, because this seems to me potentially a hugely important development.
One of the touch points between Imran's remarks and your history of leadership has been standards.
Yeah.
Let me get this
right.
Yeah. So why standards, and how do standards play into this notion of interoperability that you've talked about and Imran's mentioned as well?
Well, it's crucial. I mean, governments tend to work in a very siloed way. Every bit of government wants to do its own thing. It wants to have its own complete train set. And what we said was that world's gone. That you need to have what we called functional leadership. So for the cross-cutting functions in government, financial management, IT and digital, HR, all of these things, you need to have one place where there is a critical mass of expertise and knowledge and leadership, and with a mandate to be able to impose some requirements. It doesn't mean you do everything from the center by any means, but you have a very strong reporting line in that cross-cutting function to the center. And standards was absolutely crucial. So what we gave GDS was the power the mandate, the authority to impose some mandatory open standards. And one of the things about which we were totally militant, I was once quoted as saying, the only thing we're Stalinist about is interoperability.
Mm-hmm. When you were listening to Imran's remarks, I wonder what stood out for you, given your new perspective and the history that you've had on the identity side?
Well, I haven't been following nearly carefully enough what's going on with open banking, and I find that incredibly exciting. And if the big organizations, the big established banks really embrace this, and not just lip service, and that's kind of an if, then there's something really serious that can happen here. And of course, I mean, as Imran said, a proper ability for people to own their own identity and their identity assurance is fundamental to that, because we all know, you know, if you want to change banks or do something else with a bank, you know, the hassle there is of going through all the kind of KYC, AML stuff is a massive disincentive, and you lose, you know, you can feel your lifeblood draining away as you go through the process. So an identity that is powerfully assured enough to enable that, some of that to be short-circuited, if the regulators allow that, that can be incredibly powerful and probably quite uncomfortable for some of the big banks. So there's a lot to play out in this field.
You're not offering comfort, are you?
No, I think the key point is there's a lot to play out. So this is such an enormous topic, such an enormous area. You kind of even the easy bits are hard to do, and for me, when I look at identity and the construct whereby identity can be assured via open banking, that's really complicated, because the regulator is not in a position, I think, to embrace the transfer of liability associated with the assurance of identity. We're going to have to see how that plays out over time. Open banking itself is on a journey, and it starts with, are customers comfortable with even the construct of owning their own data? There's a level of responsibility that goes with that, and that's even before you try and get your head around all the elements of familiarity that they're going to need to get comfortable with. And so, at open banking, what we've done is we've kind of we wanted to ensure that the banks buy into this. To your point, I think the if, and we've got a fantastic foundation for that, which is number one, European legislation, Payment Services Directive 2, which is a maximum harmonisation directive, which means it's basically taken incredibly seriously and it's not to be tweaked with. And then GDPR, which is obviously an enterprise level, incredibly strong set of regulations, which comes in May. And then that underpinned by a Competition and Markets Authority order. So we've got all of the fundamental pieces aligned so that the banks are certainly investing time, effort, energy, IP, as well as capital into making this happen. And the penny has dropped, I would say, that you either embrace this or you don't. If you don't, you become a utility. You become the dumb pipes of financial services. If you embrace it, that's frankly the only way that you'll maintain any kind of customer relationship. So I'm comfortable we got bank buy-in there, but it's alien to them. It's alien to them to work together. It's alien to them to work to standards. And back to Lord Francis' point, the standards are so critical in reducing the barriers to entry. So open standards, we're not talking about centralized infrastructure, but we're talking about the way that all these bits of infrastructure need to talk together. And if we get that right, and I think we will, then you do allow all these new entrants to play on a level playing field.
Let's talk more about uncomfortableness. I remember Bill Gates once was at a conference like this, and he said, I've got lots of experts and consultants coming to me talking about what the marketplace 5 years from now will look like. But he said, I want to hear from the people that can talk about how I get from here to there. Yeah. Can each of you describe 2018 and 19 from a... You can't.
No. I mean, the point about how do you get that is always the difficult thing. I mean, when I'm talking with governments today, my starting point is, look, in any challenge, any problem you're trying to solve, only 10% of the challenge is working out what to do. It's not always obvious, but it's the easiest bit. 90% of it is working out how the hell are you going to make it happen, which is why I think that all the questions around the if of open banking are so powerful. I mean, getting all of those stars aligned so that the big established banks are incentivized to embrace it, that's tough to do because you will have all of this inertia. And you have inertia among the customers as well, because they're used to. I mean, customers by and large don't want to think about their bank. Sorry, bankers, but I mean, I've been a banker myself. They just want it to be there and work.
And I think that we're fortunate now. A lot of the stars have aligned, and we're fortunate to have lots of the important stakeholders lined up. So I'm very pleased to say that HMG, and I actually am almost at the stage of thinking of HMG as a single entity because it's really nicely coordinated across Treasury, the Competition and Markets Authority, and the FCA, and even actually the DCMS, although I need to work harder on that. So they're nicely lined up. The banks recognise that there is a new world and they have to change because the weight of this regulation is so significant. And then, of course, you've got the consumers, and that's actually a big question mark in my mind. How quickly will they move? Will they embrace it? Will they turn their back on it? They could do. But actually, there's a really important other stakeholder group in there, which is the fintechs.
Yep.
We call them third parties in regulatory parlance, but essentially they're by and large they're fintechs. And we have a fantastic resource, fantastic depth of fintechs in this country. The sector is world leading in that regard. And there are over 1,500 fintechs in the UK alone who are all vibrant businesses that are working hard on lots of different propositions and connecting with their customers in really significant ways. And actually, one of the things that we talk about at EY is the amount of adoption that fintechs are having. And the UK, again, stands head and shoulders above many of the other developed markets. And we think that in the region of 1 in 3 customer, or 1 in 3 digital consumers is already a fintech customer.
Right.
So we're talking, in the region of 20 million people who've already embraced this. And the fintechs look at it as an ability and a mechanism for actually improving the customer journey, improving the functionality, and developing new propositions. So I think the touch paper has been lit. Now, is it going to take longer than we hope? Probably. Is it going to be more successful than we expect? I hope so.
I'd like to ask both of you the same question, which is probably in the minds of many people here in the room, which is, what should we be looking for? What will be the signals of how well this is going, how challenging it will continue to be? You've mentioned one, which is the adoption and the growth of the fintech industry here in the UK. For the next couple of years, what do you recommend this lot out here be particularly mindful of to see the momentum on open banking and open identity remain and provide the leadership here in the UK?
Yeah, I'm not sure I got an easy answer to that. I think you need to see the government continuing to drive. I think gov.uk Verify has an important part to play in that. I was bothered to find that what we absolutely insisted on, which is that we have one identity assurance service platform for the whole of government, that's gone, and that's. But I know there is still a desire in some parts of the government to keep a big momentum behind and an investment in. I'm fanatical about saving money and cutting costs, but with something like this, where you've got something that is potentially kind of world leading and with the ability to be powerful across the whole of the digital economy, it is absolutely worthwhile putting a bit of money, and these are kind of penny packets in the scheme of things, behind something like gov.uk Verify, in order to reap the earlier benefits of something which has kind of interoperability and openness built into it, and where we were so concerned from the very outset that this was not something which relied on the government to be the assurer of identity. Yes, it uses public sector data as attributes, but it is not done by the government, and that the citizen, the user, has the choice of who to choose to be their identity assurer. And that was really, really important for us kind of philosophically, but also for the kind of lobby groups and the pressure groups who get very anxious about too much data being held in one place by the government. So I think that's going to be an important signal.
Okay. Anything that comes to mind?
Yeah, I think for me, if we're drawing an analogy with the work at gov.uk.verify, we're a little bit behind. So we're in implementation phase. We're trying to build this stuff. And we're running hell for leather to get the first elements of it, phase 1, if you like, up and running for the very early next year. So we are a matter of weeks away from producing live product in the market. And I think that will be fantastic. That will be a proof of concept, an MVP, if you like, that are going to allow people to really get their arms around the kind of things that we're doing here. But we're just on the verge of agreeing with all stakeholders a scope of activity that's going to take us through all of 2018 and actually into 2019, that's really going to broaden out the functionality that we've got here and also the scope of products that we are looking at. And I think that's so important for me, because once we have that, we can explain to people that this has not just been a regulatory or compliance exercise where actually, you know, the big banks are able to just walk away from it in the beginning of 2018, but we're actually on a journey, and we're on a journey that all participants should invest time and capital into in order to not just build their own propositions, but build it on a foundation stone that itself is building. I think that'll be fantastic. Now, if at the end of that, we can actually, I've no doubt in my mind that there will be a whole bunch of third parties, and including the banks themselves, who are looking at all this information and saying, why shouldn't that be an attribute to identity? And that is where you're going to end up seeing the convergence that's going to pay dividends to the consumer. At the moment, identity for open banking is a necessary item that's part of the journey. Yeah. But at what point does it then flip around and actually support identity? And not a government-based identity, but one that is decentralized and frankly in the private domain.
Imran, one piece of infrastructure that I found interesting was you talked about a whitelist. So again, this goes back to a taxonomy. In open banking, there's this notion of a directory and a registry. How does that work?
Yeah, it was interesting when we when we sat down to do the very high level architecture. The identity of the individual was important, but banks were already very comfortable and at working with individual consumer identity. But what we found is that actually it was on the B2B side. So businesses working with each other have no mechanism for digital identity that we could find. So the regulations are very clear. If a third party approaches a bank with customer consent, the bank will have to release the data that's requested by the customer. But that regulation only applies to authorized third parties. And I should have said, and there can be no terms and conditions that underpin that. So no legal contract should need to exist between those two entities beforehand. And that's anathema in the business world. The idea that another party can approach you where there's no legal contract, because the legal contract will specify who you are and the technical handshake that you would have to do. None of that exists at all. And so there's a huge question, well, you know, who's to stop either a bogus third party or a third party that is masquerading as a legitimate third party from approaching the bank? And how's the bank supposed to know? Because they can't have any legal underpinning. And even, actually, without any legal underpinning, how do they even seek redress or go after them afterwards if none of that exists? So it was a big issue, and actually we said, well, we need a digital identity for the corporate. And so what we did is, you know, in an ideal world, what would happen is that the bank, we call them the ASPSP, would look at the FCA's register and see if the third party were on the register, because if they're on the FCA's register, then they're authorized. Then they'd have to validate who that won it. All too complicated. So what we said is we'll build a centralized directory, and any third party that is on the FCA's register can apply to come onto the directory. Right? There are no criteria other than identity checks. Right? There's no other barrier to getting onto it. If you're on there, you can prove who you are, you can come on here. Now, once you're on the directory, then actually you will get issued with a digital certificate. And then when the API call is made from that legitimate third party, the digital certificate is embedded in the API call, and then that's provided direct to the bank, and the bank is comfortable that they're dealing with a legitimate actor. Now, what's kind of interesting about that is we needed to do that in order to make PSD2 work. But actually, digital identity for corporates operating in an API world is fundamental. So we regularly get incoming requests as, well, you've created the directory to do this, can you leverage it into lots of other situations? And not just in the UK, but actually across Europe.
We need rules of the road, do we
Yeah.
not? Yeah.
Well, again, it comes down to kind of interoperability and levels of trust between in different jurisdictions and some similar kind of protections. I mean, the truth is that, I mean, one of the things that hasn't yet happened, but as we go further down this road, is understanding where liability lies and how you manage the risk. And there will always be risk. There is no way of doing this stuff without risk. But it's working out, and actually at the end of it, it doesn't much matter where the liability lies as long as it's understood and accepted, because then you can insure it. And as you get into this world, there will be a market to insure these risks wherever they lie. But you need to kind of have the understanding, which should be ideally kind of broadly the same ballpark in the different jurisdictions.
That's right. We have lots of cyber insurance now, but we don't have insurance that really speaks to...
Yeah, but it was interesting. I mean, I did quite a lot of work on cyber insurance because I had responsibility for the government cybersecurity program. And we did a big exercise, because I mean, actually it ought to be something that the UK is good at, because we're good at cyber and we're good at insurance. So actually developing that as a product out of London ought to be fantastic as a trade thing.
It seems like the registry and the directory that Imran is describing is a step towards giving the insurers the hard edges that they need in order to calculate.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
And I dare say that the growth of this kind of insurance product set is a leading indicator of how successful open banking and open identity is taking root here in London and in the UK.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, it's something that will kind of emerge. But again, sometimes it needs the government to be the stimulus behind it, as we were on the cyber front.
I'm actually very pleased to say that what under PSD2 they're trying to do is ensure that they create as open a playing field as possible. So they're trying to make the regulatory requirements for third parties to be as low as possible. But of course, if you're now dealing with customers' data and so on, these are significant responsibilities and potentially huge liabilities. So one of the things that they have all required is that in order to become authorized, you have to have sufficient professional indemnity insurance, which is an umbrella that includes cyber. And actually, probably starting 6 months ago, we walked around Lloyd's of London and said there is going to be a requirement. If this part of the market isn't functioning, no one can get regulated. If no one gets regulated, then this whole thing doesn't work. So this is a critical piece. And in London, the expertise was there. And I'm pleased to say that those insurance policies, to be honest, they were already in the market. They just needed to be recreated, repackaged in the right way. And I think the insurers are dipping their toe into this market, which is great, and they need to do it. And like all insurers, they need to learn, they need to develop a track record, and that understanding is just going to improve all the time. It is interesting to see how they are going to adapt over time to find out where the liability really does sit in this whole process. Because the regulation is very clear that the customers will be looked after and they will be made whole, and the liability. Lots of rules have been made, but then actually, we live in a precedent-based kind of legal system in society. We're going to figure out actually where all this sits over time.
The post-Brexit, Britain, post-Brexit, London as a financial centre, can be incredibly powerful as long as we maintain that totally kind of outward-looking, open approach. But in any suggestion that that's not of a lack of understanding in the government, that is what makes this such a great place, would be bad for the future.
Well, I wanted to thank you both. This has been just wonderful.
Can we have a big hand for our first panel, please? We do have the opportunity for audience questions for this panel. Yes, sir.
Post Office. Do you think there's a contradiction between the more risk-based approach to KYC and AML regulation versus the standards-based approach you talked about for identity?
No, I don't see why. I don't know why there should be. I mean, the more you can get away from kind of going through a process and more risk related, it's got to be better. It's got to be quicker. I don't see why there's that should be a problem. I mean, I find as someone who opened a business bank account within the last year, I found the process incredibly tortuous and painful and drawn out, and just making it less of a process, more of a function. I think with some real judgment being exercised in a sensible, grown-up way, kind of feels like a good way to go.
Thank you. More questions, please?
Thank you. I'm Antonio Virti, CEO of OBIE. A question about interoperability. So Gov.uk Verify was created also with EIDAS regulation, I think, in mind as a baseline. Post-Brexit, will that remain for interoperability? EIDAS as the main guiding principle, or is there a risk that something is going to change on that side? What do you think?
Well, I'm not world expert on EIDAS, but I know of no reason why that should change. I mean, if there's a sensible approach and sensible kind of pragmatic approach, no reason why that should change that I know of.
And I'd probably just say on open banking, the standards that we're looking to create, we're trying to make them from the very get-go fully interoperable with anything that's created across Europe.
Yeah.
And we're having some of those discussions. The great situation that we're in is because of this additional regulatory stick from the Competition and Markets Authority, the UK has got its act together far quicker than, in fact, any of the other European countries. And because our standards are open source, we're making it fully available to them, encouraging them, working with them actually to set the standard for Europe.
Ian Litton, Positive Actuaries Limited. Imran, you mentioned the centrality of consent, and you've mentioned the importance of standards. So I'm just wondering whether there's going to be a standards approach to consent that's going to underpin open banking. I'm thinking particularly of user-managed access, UMA, and whether you're considering that as the mechanism for managing consent.
Sorry, can you say the last bit?
Are you looking at user-managed access, UMA, as the mechanism for managing consent?
So one of always the tricky thing when it comes to standards is you don't want the standards to go too far, because if they go too far, then you actually quash innovation. But at the same time, you want everything to be able to talk to each other. So what we've done is we've lent heavily on GDPR and the guidelines, the principles of GDPR in terms of creating the consent mechanism, if you like. So there's a good degree of flexibility around that. It's not a template for consent. There's not 68 different consents you can ask for, and you have to choose one of those. But what we do have is, in terms of the API structure, is a concept of what we call data clusters. And these data clusters are defined, so the consents need to link back to those. So we've taken more of a data-centric view around the standards, rather than a consent or even a use case view around building standards for that piece.
Thank you very much. And I'm afraid, in terms of questions, that concludes our first panel this morning. So please, can you again thank our esteemed guests, and thank you so much for this.